Imagine the brain could reboot, updating its withered and damaged cells with new, improved units. That may sound like science fiction, but it's a potential reality scientists are investigating right now. Will our brains one day be able to self-repair? It's well known that embryonic cells in our young, developing brains produce new neurons, the microscopic units that make up the brain's tissue. Those newly generated neurons migrate to various parts of the developing brain, making it self-organize into different structures. But until recently, scientists thought cell production came to an abrupt halt soon after this initial growth, leading them to conclude that neurological diseases, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and damaging events like strokes, are irreversible. But a series of recent discoveries has revealed that adult brains actually do continue to produce new cells in at least 3 specialized locations. This process, known as neurogenesis, involves dedicated brain cells called neural stem cells and progenitor cells, which manufacture new neurons or replace the old ones. The 3 regions where neurogenesis has been discovered are the dentate gyrus, associated with learning and memory, the subventricular zone, which may supply neurons to the olfactory bulb for communication between the nose and brain, and the striatum, which helps manage movement. Scientists don't yet have a good grasp on exactly what role neurogenesis plays in any of these regions, or why they have this ability that's absent from the rest of the brain. But the mere presence of a mechanism to grow new neurons in the adult brain opens up an amazing possibility. Could we harness that mechanism to get the brain to heal its scars? Similar to how new skin grows to patch up a wound, or a broken bone stitches itself back together. So here's where we stand. Certain proteins and other small molecules that mimic those proteins can be administered to the brain to make neural stem cells and progenitor cells produce more neurons in those 3 locations. This technique still needs improvement so that the cells reproduce more efficiently and more cells survive. But research shows that progenitor cells from these areas can actually migrate to places where injury has occurred and give rise to new neurons there. And another promising possible approach is to transplant healthy human neural stem cells, which are cultured in a laboratory, to injured tissue, like we can do with skin. Scientists are currently experimenting to determine whether transplanted donor cells can divide, differentiate, and successfully give rise to new neurons in a damaged brain. They've also discovered that we might be able to teach other kinds of brain cells, such as astrocytes or oligodendrocytes, to behave like neural stem cells and start generating neurons too. So, a couple of decades from now, will our brains be able to self-repair? We can't say for sure, but that has become one of the major goals of regenerative medicine. The human brain has 100 billion neurons, and we're still figuring out the wiring behind this huge biological motherboard. But every day, research on neurogenesis brings us closer to that reboot switch.
In 1978, Louise Brown became the world's first baby to be born by in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Her birth revolutionized the field of reproductive medicine. Given that approximately 1 in 8 heterosexual couples has difficulty conceiving, and that homosexual couples and single parents often need clinical help to make a baby, the demand for IVF has been growing. IVF is so common that more than 5 million babies have been born through this technology. IVF works by mimicking the brilliant design of sexual reproduction. In order to understand IVF, we first need to take a look at the natural process of baby making. Believe it or not, it all starts in the brain. Roughly 15 days before fertilization can happen, the anterior pituitary gland secretes follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, which ripens a handful of follicles of the ovary that then release estrogen. Each follicle contains one egg, and on average, only one follicle becomes fully mature. As it grows and continues to release estrogen, this hormone not only helps coordinate growth and preparation of the uterus, it also communicates to the brain how well the follicle is developing. When the estrogen level is high enough, the anterior pituitary releases a surge of luteinizing hormone, LH, which triggers ovulation and causes the follicle to rupture and release the egg. Once the egg leaves the ovary, it is directed into the fallopian tube by the finger-like fimbriae. If the egg is not fertilized by sperm within 24 hours, the unfertilized egg will die, and the entire system will reset itself, preparing to create a new egg and uterine lining the following month. The egg is the largest cell in the body and is protected by a thick extracellular shell of sugar and protein called the zona pellucida. The zona thwarts the entry and fusion of more than one sperm, the smallest cell in the body. It takes a man 2 to 3 months to make sperm, and the process constantly renews. Each ejaculation during sexual intercourse releases more than 100 million sperm, but only 100 or so will ultimately make it to the proximity of the egg, and only one will successfully penetrate through the armor of the zona pellucida. Upon successful fertilization, the zygote immediately begins developing into an embryo and takes about 3 days to reach the uterus. There, it requires another 3 or so days to implant firmly into the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. Once implanted, the cells that are to become the placenta secrete a hormone that signals to the ovulated follicle that there is a pregnancy in the uterus. This helps rescue that follicle, now called the corpus luteum, from degenerating as it normally would do in that stage of the menstrual cycle. The corpus luteum is responsible for producing the progesterone required to maintain the pregnancy until 6 to 7 weeks of gestation, when the placenta develops and takes over until the baby is born approximately 40 weeks later. Now, how do you make a baby in a lab? In patients undergoing IVF, FSH is administered at levels that are higher than naturally occurring to cause a controlled overstimulation of the ovaries so that they ultimately produce multiple eggs. The eggs are then retrieved just before ovulation would occur, while the woman is under anesthesia through an aspirating needle that is guided by ultrasound. Most sperm samples are produced by masturbation. In the laboratory, the identified eggs are stripped of surrounding cells and prepared for fertilization in a petri dish. Fertilization can occur by one of 2 techniques. In the first, the eggs are incubated with thousands of sperm, and fertilization occurs naturally over a few hours. The second technique maximizes certainty of fertilization by using a needle to place a single sperm inside the egg. This is particularly useful when there is a problem with the quality of the sperm. After fertilization, embryos can be further screened for genetic suitability, frozen for later attempted pregnancies, or delivered into the woman's uterus via catheter. Common convention is to transfer the embryo 3 days after fertilization, when the embryo has 8 cells, or on day 5, when the embryo is called a blastocyst and has hundreds of cells. If the woman's eggs are of poor quality due to age or toxic exposures or have been removed due to cancer, donor eggs may be used. In the case that the intended mother has a problematic uterus or lacks one, another woman, called a gestational carrier or surrogate, can use her uterus to carry the pregnancy. To increase the odds of success, which are as high as 40% for a woman younger than 35, doctors sometimes transfer multiple embryos at once, which is why IVF results in twins and triplets more often than natural pregnancies. However, most clinics seek to minimize the chances of multiple pregnancies, as they are riskier for mothers and babies. Millions of babies, like Louise Brown, have been born from IVF and have had normal, healthy lives. the long-term health consequences of ovarian stimulation with IVF medicines are less clear, though so far, IVF seems safe for women. Because of better genetic testing, delayed childbearing, increased accessibility, and diminishing costs, it's not inconceivable that artificial baby-making via IVF and related techniques could outpace natural reproduction in years to come.
How much would you pay for a bouquet of tulips? A few dollars? $100? How about $1 million? Probably not. Well, how much would you pay for this house? Or partial ownership of a website that sells pet supplies? At different points in time, tulips, real estate, and stock in pets.com have all sold for much more than they were worth. In each instance, the price rose and rose and then abruptly plummeted. Economists call this a bubble. So what exactly is going on with a bubble? Well, let's start with the tulips to get a better idea. The 17th century saw the Netherlands enter the Dutch Golden Age. By the 1630s, Amsterdam was an important port and commercial center. Dutch ships imported spices from Asia in huge quantities to earn profits in Europe. So Amsterdam was brimming with wealthy, skilled merchants and traders who displayed their prosperity by living in mansions surrounded by flower gardens. And there was one flower in particularly high demand, the tulip. The tulip was brought to Europe on trading vessels that sailed from the east. Because of this, it was considered an exotic flower that was also difficult to grow since it could take years for a single tulip to bloom. During the 1630s, an outbreak of tulip-breaking virus made select flowers even more beautiful by lining petals with multicolor, flame-like streaks. A tulip like this was scarcer than a normal tulip, and as a result, prices for these flowers started to rise, and with them, the tulip's popularity. It wasn't long before the tulip became a nationwide sensation, and tulip mania was born. A mania occurs when there is an upward movement of price combined with a willingness to pay large sums of money for something valued much lower in intrinsic value. A recent example of this is the dot-com mania of the 1990s. Stocks in new, exciting websites were like the tulips of the 17th century. Everybody wanted some. The more people who wanted the tulip, the higher the price could go. At one point, a single tulip bulb sold for more than 10 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman. In the stock market, the price of stock is based on the supply and demand of investors. Stock prices tend to rise when it seems like a company will earn more in the future. Investors might then buy more of the stock, raising the prices even further due to an increased demand. This can result in a feedback loop where investors get caught up in the hype and ultimately drive prices far above intrinsic value, creating a bubble. All that is needed for a mania to end and for a bubble to burst is the collective realization that the price of the stock, or a tulip, far exceeds its worth. That's what happened with both manias. Suddenly, the demand ended. Prices were pushed to staggering lows, and pop! The bubbles burst, and the market crashed. Today, scholars work long and hard trying to predict what causes a bubble and how to avoid them. Tulip mania is an effective illustration of the underlying principles at work in a bubble and can help us understand more recent examples, like the real estate bubble of the late 2000s. The economy will continue to go through phases of booms and busts. So while we wait for the next mania to start and the next bubble to burst, treat yourself to a bouquet of tulips and enjoy the fact that you didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for them. This is the story of 3 plastic bottles, empty and discarded. Their journeys are about to diverge, with outcomes that impact nothing less than the fate of the planet. But they weren't always this way. To understand where these bottles end up, we must first explore their origins. The heroes of our story were conceived in this oil refinery. The plastic in their bodies was formed by chemically bonding oil and gas molecules together to make monomers. In turn, these monomers were bonded into long polymer chains to make plastic, in the form of millions of pellets. Those were melted at manufacturing plants and reformed in molds to create the resilient material that makes up the triplets' bodies. Machines filled the bottles with sweet, bubbly liquid, and they were then wrapped, shipped, bought, opened, consumed, and unceremoniously discarded. And now here they lie, poised at the edge of the unknown. Bottle 1, like hundreds of millions of tons of his plastic brethren, ends up in a landfill. This huge dump expands each day as more trash comes in and continues to take up space. As plastics sit there being compressed amongst layers of other junk, rainwater flows through the waste and absorbs the water-soluble compounds it contains, and some of those are highly toxic. Together, they create a harmful stew called leachate, which can move into groundwater, soil, and streams, poisoning ecosystems and harming wildlife. It can take bottle 1 an agonizing 1,000 years to decompose. Bottle 2's journey is stranger, but unfortunately no happier. He floats on a trickle that reaches a stream that flows into a river, and a river that reaches the ocean. After months lost at sea, he's slowly drawn into a massive vortex where trash accumulates, a place known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Here, the ocean's currents have trapped millions of pieces of plastic debris. This is one of 5 plastic-filled gyres in the world's seas, places where the pollutants turn the water into a cloudy plastic soup. Some animals, like seabirds, get entangled in the mess. They and others mistake the brightly colored plastic bits for food. Plastic makes them feel full when they're not, so they starve to death and pass the toxins from the plastic up the food chain. For example, it's eaten by lanternfish. The lanternfish are eaten by squid. The squid are eaten by tuna. And the tuna are eaten by us. And most plastics don't biodegrade, which means they're destined to break down into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics, which might rotate in the sea eternally. But Bottle 3 is spared the cruel purgatories of his brothers. A truck brings him to a plant where he and his companions are squeezed flat and compressed into a block. Okay, this sounds pretty bad too, but hang in there. It gets better. The blocks are shredded into tiny pieces, which are washed and melted so they become the raw materials that can be used again. As if by magic, Bottle 3 is now ready to be reborn as something completely new. For this bit of plastic with such humble origins, suddenly, the sky is the limit. Why are most manhole covers round? Sure, it makes them easy to roll and slide into place in any alignment. But there's another, more compelling reason involving a peculiar geometric property of circles and other shapes. Imagine a square separating 2 parallel lines. As it rotates, the lines first push apart, then come back together. But try this with a circle, and the lines stay exactly the same distance apart, the diameter of the circle. This makes the circle, unlike the square, a mathematical shape called a curve of constant width. Another shape with this property is the rouleau triangle. To create one, start with an equilateral triangle, then make one of the vertices the center of a circle that touches the other 2. Draw 2 more circles in the same way, centered on the other 2 vertices, and there it is, in the space where they all overlap. Because rouleau triangles can rotate between parallel lines without changing their distance, they can work as wheels, provided a little creative engineering. And if you rotate one while rolling its midpoint in a nearly circular path, its perimeter traces out a square with rounded corners, allowing triangular drill bits to carve out square holes. Any polygon with an odd number of sides can be used to generate a curve of constant width, using the same method we applied earlier, though there are many others that aren't made in this way. For example, if you roll any curve of constant width around another, you'll make a third one. This collection of pointy curves fascinates mathematicians. They've given us Barbier's theorem, which says that the perimeter of any curve of constant width, not just a circle, equals pi times the diameter. Another theorem tells us that if you had a bunch of curves of constant width with the same width, they would all have the same perimeter, but the rouleau triangle would have the smallest area. The circle, which is effectively a rouleau polygon with an infinite number of sides, has the largest. In 3 dimensions, we can make surfaces of constant width, like the rouleau tetrahedron, formed by taking a tetrahedron, expanding a sphere from each vertex until it touches the opposite vertices, and throwing everything away except the region where they overlap. Surfaces of constant width maintain a constant distance between 2 parallel planes, so you could throw a bunch of rouleau tetrahedra on the floor and slide a board across them as smoothly as if they were marbles. Now back to manhole covers. A square manhole cover's short edge could line up with the wider part of the hole and fall right in. But a curve of constant width won't fall in any orientation. Usually they're circular, but keep your eyes open and you just might come across a rouleau triangle manhole. What's that sound? Depending on whom you ask, the crackle of popping joints is either the sound of sweet relief or the noxious tones of a stomach-turning habit. Really though, what's that sound? I mean, why does bending your joints in a certain way make them pop like that? Scientists have offered several explanations, including rapidly stretching ligaments and, in severe cases, actual bones grinding against each other. But the most common explanation for why your stretched out joints sound like bubbles popping is that, well, there are bubbles in there. The joints in your fingers are the easiest ones to crack, but many people also crack the joints between vertebrae in their neck and back, and even their hips, wrists, shoulders, and so on. All these joints are synovial joints, and they're the most flexible ones in your body. The space between the 2 bones is filled with a viscous liquid, synovial fluid, which contains long, lubricating molecules like hyaluronic acid and lubricin. Synovial fluid is more or less the texture of egg yolk, and its primary purpose is to cushion the bones and help them glide past each other. It also contains phagocytic cells that help clean up any bone or cartilage debris that ends up in the joint. But the reason it's important for knuckle cracking is that, like other fluids in your body, it contains lots of dissolved gas molecules. Knuckle crackers know that to get that satisfying pop, you stretch the joint farther than it normally goes, by bending your fingers backwards, for example. When you do that, the bones move away from each other. The space between bones gets bigger, but the amount of synovial fluid stays constant. That creates a low-pressure zone that pulls dissolved gases out of the synovial fluid, just like the carbon dioxide that fizzes out of soda when you twist open the cap. Inside the joint, the escaping gases form a bubble with a pop. But the bubble doesn't last long. The surrounding fluid presses on it until it finally collapses. The bubble's gases scatter throughout the synovial cavity and slowly dissolve back into the fluid over the course of about 20 minutes, which is why it can take a while before you can pop the same joint again. Some scientists think there may actually be two pops, one when the bubble forms and another when it bursts. Popping a joint temporarily enlarges it, which may be why dedicated knuckle, neck, and back crackers say the habit makes their joints feel looser and more flexible. But you may have heard from a concerned relative or annoyed office mate that cracking your joints will give you arthritis. A doctor named Donald Unger heard this too. So, determined to disprove his mother's warnings, he cracked the knuckles of his left hand repeatedly for 50 years, while the right hand knuckles went unpopped. 36,500 cracks later, both hands were arthritis-free. For this selfless act of devotion to science, Dr. Unger received an Ig Nobel Prize, a parody of the Nobel Prize that recognizes wacky but weirdly fascinating scientific accomplishments. Unger wrote that his results should prompt investigation into other parental beliefs, like the importance of eating spinach. The jury's still out on that one. As for knuckle cracking, one study suggests that all that joint stretching and bubble bursting can cause your hands to swell and weaken your grip. But the biggest proven danger seems to be annoying those around you.
So the apocalypse has happened, the zombies have come and gone, and all plant life on Earth has died somehow. All you have are some basic supplies and some seeds of a few types of essential plants. So what should you do to make absolutely sure they grow, seeing how rebuilding human civilization absolutely depends on it? Well, you'd probably think the last thing you should do with these crucially important seeds is something like poking holes in them, or grinding them with sandpaper, or throwing them in acid or hot water. But in fact, all of these are methods that are commonly used to help seeds start growing. A typical seed consists of a plant embryo encased in a hard seed coat. To start growing, it needs to emerge or sprout from inside this shell. This process is called germination. But just as it would be hard for you to get out of a jail cell with no windows and no doors, the embryo might need a little help escaping from its seed prison. And any process that makes this easier by wearing down the seed coat is called scarification. This lets moisture and nutrients get through the seed coat, making the embryo start growing until it breaks through. Now, you might be wondering why it is that plants would need humans to do all these weird things to their seeds in order to grow. And in fact, they don't. In natural environments, seed coats are worn down by cold temperatures, bacteria, or even animal digestion. Our scarification methods just mimic and accelerate these natural processes to increase the chances of successful germination. One technique we can use is called nicking. To do this, we make a small cut or scratch into the seed coat. Be careful not to cut too deep. You don't want to damage the plant embryo inside. Another way is to file down the seed coat using sandpaper or a nail file. Once again, you don't want to file too much, just enough to wear down some of the seed coat. After applying either of these methods, you'll want to spray the seeds with bleach to prevent mold. Seeds can also be soaked in water to soften the coat. One way to do this is to place the seeds in a nylon bag, then place the bag into hot water. Turn off the heat immediately and allow the water to cool to room temperature before removing the seeds. It's important not to heat the seed for too long, as this will kill the embryo. Again, you'll want to spray them with bleach afterwards. Finally, you can try immersing the seeds in a sulfuric acid solution. Make sure you're wearing protective goggles and gloves any time you work with such a dangerous substance. Place the seeds into a wire mesh pouch and immerse the pouch in the solution for 10 minutes. Then take out the pouch and rinse it with clean water. Take out the seeds and, as before, spray them with bleach so they don't get moldy. If you try all of these methods, you will see that some of them are more effective than others, and some work best for different types of plants that have harder or thicker coats. So knowing what seed scarification techniques work best will be useful if you ever need to survive a cataclysm, start a farm, or just want to plant your own garden.
If you live on the east coast of the United States, you've spent the last 17 years of your life walking, eating, and sleeping above a dormant army of insects. These are the cicadas. Every 17 years, billions of them emerge from the ground to do three things: molt, mate, and die. There are 15 different broods of cicadas out there, grouped by when they'll emerge from the ground. Some of these broods are on a 13-year cycle, others are on a 17-year clock. Either way, the cicadas live underground for most of their lives, feeding on the juices of plant roots. When it's time to emerge, the adults will begin to burrow their way out of the ground and up to the surface, where they will live for just a few weeks. During these weeks, though, everybody will know that cicadas have arrived. There will be billions of them, and they're loud. Male cicadas band together to call for female mates, and their collective chorus can reach up to 100 decibels, as loud as a chainsaw. In fact, if you happen to be using a chainsaw or lawnmower, male cicadas will flock to you, thinking that you're one of them. Now, like most things in nature, the cicadas don't arrive without a posse. There are all sorts of awesome and gross predators and parasites that come along with the buzzing bugs. Take the fungus Massospora, for example. This little white fungus buries itself in the cicada's abdomen and eats the bug alive, leaving behind its spores. When those spores rupture, they burst out of the still alive cicada, turning the bug into a flying salt shaker of death, raining spores down upon its unsuspecting cicada neighbors. But while we know pretty precisely when the cicadas will arrive and fade away, we're still not totally certain of why. There are certain advantages to having your entire species emerge at once, of course. The sheer number of cicadas coming out of the ground is so overwhelming to predators that it's essentially guaranteed that a few bugs will survive and reproduce. And since cicadas emerge every 13 or 17 years, longer than the lifespan of many of their predators, the animals that eat them don't learn to depend on their availability. But why 13 and 17 years instead of 16 or 18 or 12? Well, that part no one really knows. It's possible the number just happened by chance, or perhaps cicadas really love prime numbers. Eventually, the cicadas will mate and slowly die off, their call fading into the distance. The eggs that they lay will begin the cycle again, their cicada babies burrowing into the earth, feeding on plant juice and waiting for their turn to darken the skies and fill the air with their songs. In 17 years, they'll be ready. Will you?
Everybody loves fireworks. The lights, the colors, and of course, the big boom. But the history of fireworks isn't all hugs and celebrations. Long before epic fireworks displays, chemists in China invented the key ingredient that propels those bright lights into the sky. That invention was what we now call gunpowder. Our story begins back in ancient China in the mid-9th century, where early Chinese alchemists were trying to create a potion for immortality. Instead, what they created was a flammable powder that burned down many of their homes. They quickly realized that this black powder, which they called fire medicine, was precisely the opposite of something that would make you live forever. In these early days, the Chinese hadn't yet figured out how to make the powder explode. It was simply very flammable, and their armies used it to make flaming arrows and even a flamethrower. But once they figured out the right proportions of ingredients to create a blast, they began using the powder even more, creating fireworks to keep evil spirits away, and bombs to defend themselves against Mongol invaders. It was these Mongols, most likely, who spread the invention of gunpowder across the world. After fielding Chinese attacks, they learned how to produce the powder themselves and brought it with them on their conquests in Persia and India. William of Rubruck, a European ambassador to the Mongols, was likely responsible for bringing gunpowder back to Europe around 1254. From there, engineers and military inventors created all kinds of destructive weapons. From bombs to guns to cannons, gunpowder left its mark on the world in some pretty terrible ways, in contrast to the beautiful marks it can leave in the air. So how does black powder propel fireworks into the sky? You might have seen old westerns or cartoons where a trail of gunpowder is lit and it leads to a large and obviously explosive barrel. Once the fire gets to the barrel, a large boom occurs. But why doesn't the trail itself explode? The reason is that burning the powder releases energy and gases. While the trail is burning, these are easily released into the surrounding air. But when the gunpowder is contained within the barrel, the energy and gases cannot easily escape and build up until, boom. Firework canisters provide a single upward-facing outlet to channel this explosive energy. The wick ignites the gunpowder, and the energy takes the easiest exit from the canister, launching the firework high into the sky. The flame then makes its way through the fireworks encasing, and the same reaction occurs high above our heads. So while the Chinese alchemists never found the compound for eternal life, they did find something that would go on to shape all of civilization, something that has caused many tragic moments in human history, and yet still gives us hope when we look up in celebration at the colorful night sky. What if you could absorb another organism and take on its abilities? Imagine you swallowed a small bird and suddenly gained the ability to fly. Or if you engulfed a cobra and were then able to spit poisonous venom from your teeth. Throughout the history of life, specifically during the evolution of complex eukaryotic cells, things like this happened all the time. One organism absorbed another, and they united to become a new organism with the combined abilities of both. We think that around 2 billion years ago, the only living organisms on Earth were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms lacking membrane-bound organelles. Let's look closely at just 3 of them. One was a big, simple, blob-like cell with the ability to absorb things by wrapping its cell membrane around them. Another was a bacterial cell that converted solar energy into sugar molecules through photosynthesis. A third used oxygen gas to break down materials like sugar and release its energy into a form useful for life activities. The blob cells would occasionally absorb the little photosynthetic bacteria. These bacteria then lived inside the blob and divided like they always had, but their existence became linked. If you stumbled upon this living arrangement, you might just think that the whole thing was one organism, that the green photosynthetic bacteria were just a part of the blob that performed one of its life functions, just like your heart is a part of you that performs the function of pumping your blood. This process of cells living together is called endosymbiosis, one organism living inside another. But the endosymbiosis didn't stop there. What would happen if the other bacteria moved in too? Now the cells of this species started becoming highly complex. They were big and full of intricate structures that we call chloroplasts and mitochondria. These structures worked together to harness sunlight, make sugar, and break down that sugar using the oxygen that right around this time started to appear in the Earth's atmosphere. Organisms absorbing other organisms was one way species adapted to the changing environmental conditions of their surroundings. This little story highlights what biologists call the endosymbiotic theory, the current best explanation of how complex cells evolved. There's a lot of evidence that supports this theory, but let's look at 3 main pieces. First, the chloroplasts and mitochondria in our cells multiply the very same way as those ancient bacteria, which are still around, by the way. In fact, if you destroy these structures in a cell, No new ones will appear. The cell can't make them. They can only make more of themselves. Second piece of evidence. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both contain their own DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA has a circular structure that is strikingly similar to the DNA of the ancient bacteria, and it also contains many similar genes. The ribosomes, or protein assembly machines of chloroplasts and mitochondria, also have the same structure as ribosomes of ancient bacteria, but are different from the ribosomes hanging around the rest of the eukaryotic cell. Lastly, think about the membranes involved in the engulfing process. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both have two membranes surrounding them, an inner and outer membrane. Their inner membrane contains some particular lipids and proteins that are not present in the outer membrane. Why is that significant? Because their outer membrane used to belong to the blob cell. When they were engulfed in the endosymbiosis process, they got wrapped up in that membrane and kept their own as their inner one. Surely enough, those same lipids and proteins are found on the membranes of the ancient bacteria. Biologists now use this theory to explain the origin of the vast variety of eukaryotic organisms. Take the green algae that grow on the walls of swimming pools. A larger eukaryotic cell with spinning tail structures, or flagella, at some point absorbed algae like these to form what we now call euglena. Euglena can perform photosynthesis, break down sugar using oxygen, and swim around pond water. And as the theory would predict, the chloroplasts in these euglena have 3 membranes, since they had 2 before being engulfed. The absorbing process of endosymbiotic theory allowed organisms to combine powerful abilities to become better adapted to life on Earth. The results were species capable of much more than when they were separate organisms. And this was an evolutionary leap that led to the microorganisms, plants, and animals we observe on the planet today. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them, quoth William Shakespeare. Or did he? Some people question whether Shakespeare really wrote the works that bear his name, or whether he even existed at all. They speculate that Shakespeare was a pseudonym for another writer or a group of writers. Proposed candidates for the real Shakespeare include other famous playwrights, politicians, and even some prominent women. Could it be true that the greatest writer in the English language was as fictional as his plays? Most Shakespeare scholars dismiss these theories based on historical and biographical evidence. But there is another way to test whether Shakespeare's famous lines were actually written by someone else. Linguistics, the study of language, can tell us a great deal about the way we speak and write by examining syntax, grammar, semantics, and vocabulary. And in the late 1800s, a Polish philosopher named Wincenty Lutosławski formalized a method known as stylometry, applying this knowledge to investigate questions of literary authorship. So how does stylometry work? The idea is that each writer's style has certain characteristics that remain fairly uniform among individual works. Examples of characteristics include average sentence length, the arrangement of words, and even the number of occurrences of a particular word. Let's look at use of the word "the" and visualize it as a dimension or axis. Each of Shakespeare's works can be placed on that axis, like a data point, based on the number of occurrences of that word. In statistics, the tightness of these points gives us what is known as the variance, an expected range for our data. But this is only a single characteristic in a very high-dimensional space. With a clustering tool called principal component analysis, we can reduce the multidimensional space into simple principal components that collectively measure the variance in Shakespeare's works. We can then test the works of our candidates against those principal components. For example, If enough works of Francis Bacon fall within the Shakespearean variants, that would be pretty strong evidence that Francis Bacon and Shakespeare are actually the same person. What did the results show? Well, the stylometrists who carried this out have concluded that Shakespeare is none other than Shakespeare. The bard is the bard. The Pretender's works just don't match up with Shakespeare's signature style. However, our intrepid statisticians did find some compelling evidence of collaborations. For instance, one recent study concluded that Shakespeare worked with playwright Christopher Marlowe on Henry VI, Parts 1 and 2. Shakespeare's identity is only one of the many problems stylometry can resolve. It can help us determine when a work was written, whether an ancient text is a forgery, whether a student has committed plagiarism, or if that email you just received is of a high priority or spam. And does the timeless poetry of Shakespeare's lines just boil down to numbers and statistics? Not quite. Stylometric analysis may reveal what makes Shakespeare's works structurally distinct, but it cannot capture the beauty of the sentiments and emotions they express, or why they affect us the way they do. At least, not yet.
What's the worst bug on the planet? You might vote for the horsefly or perhaps the wasp, but for many people, the worst offender is by far the mosquito. The buzzing, the biting, the itching. The mosquito is one of the most commonly detested pests in the world. In Alaska, swarms of mosquitoes can get so thick that they actually asphyxiate caribou, and mosquito-borne diseases kill millions of people every year. The scourge that is the mosquito isn't new. Mosquitoes have been around for over 100 million years, and over that time have co-evolved with all sorts of species, including our own. There are actually thousands of species of mosquitoes in the world, but they all share one insidious quality. They suck blood, and they're really, really good at sucking blood. Here's how they do it. After landing, the mosquito will slather some saliva onto the victim's skin, which works like an antiseptic, numbing the spot so we don't notice their attack. This is what causes the itchy red bumps, by the way. Then the bug will use its serrated mandibles to carve a little hole in your skin, allowing it to probe around with its proboscis, searching for a blood vessel. When it hits one, the lucky parasite can suck 2 to 3 times its weight in blood. Turns out we don't really like that too much. In fact, humans hate mosquitoes so much that we spend billions of dollars worldwide to keep them away from us. From citronella candles to bug sprays to heavy-duty agricultural pesticides. But it's not just that mosquitoes are annoying. They're also deadly. Mosquitoes can transmit everything from malaria to yellow fever to West Nile virus to dengue. Over 1 million people worldwide die every year from mosquito-borne diseases. And that's just people. Horses, dogs, cats, they can all get diseases from mosquitoes too. So if these bugs are so dastardly, why don't we just get rid of them? We are humans after all, and we're pretty good at getting rid of species. Well, it's not quite so simple. Getting rid of the mosquito removes a food source for lots of organisms like frogs and fish and birds. Without them, plants would lose a pollinator. But some scientists say that mosquitoes aren't actually all that important. If we got rid of them, they argue, another species would simply take their place, and we'd probably have far fewer deaths from malaria. The problem is that nobody knows what would happen if we killed off all the mosquitoes. Something better might take their spot, or perhaps something even worse. The question is, are we willing to take that risk? Can you read in the car? If so, consider yourself pretty lucky. For about 1/3 of the population, looking at a book while moving along in a car, or boat, or train, or plane, quickly makes them sick to their stomach. But why do we get motion sickness in the first place? Well, believe it or not, scientists aren't exactly sure. The most common theory has to do with mismatched sensory signals. When you travel in a car, your body's getting 2 very different messages. Your eyes are seeing the inside of the vehicle, which doesn't seem to be moving. Meanwhile, your ear is actually telling your brain that you're accelerating. Wait, your ear? Yeah, your ear actually has another important function besides hearing. In its innermost part lies a group of structures known as the vestibular system, which gives us our sense of balance and movement. Inside there are 3 semicircular tubules that can sense rotation, one for each dimension of space. And there are also 2 hair-lined sacs that are filled with fluid. So when you move, the fluid shifts and tickles the hairs, telling your brain whether you're moving horizontally or vertically. With all these combined, your body can sense which direction you're moving in, how much you've accelerated, even at what angle. So when you're in the car, your vestibular system correctly senses your movement, but your eyes don't see it, especially if they're glued to a book. The opposite can happen too. Say you're sitting in a movie theater and the camera makes a broad, sweeping move. This time, it's your eyes that think you're moving, while your ear knows that you're sitting still. But why does this conflicting information have to make us feel so terrible? Scientists aren't sure about that either, but they think that there's an evolutionary explanation. You see, both fast-moving vehicles and video recordings have only existed in the last couple of centuries, barely a blink in evolutionary time. For most of our history, there just wasn't that much that could cause this kind of sensory mix-up, except for poisons. And because poisons are not the best thing for survival, our bodies evolved a very direct, but not very pleasant way to get rid of whatever we might have eaten that was causing the confusion. This theory seems pretty reasonable, but it leaves a lot of things unexplained, like why women are more affected by motion sickness than men, or why passengers get more nauseous than drivers. Another theory suggests that the cause may have more to do with the way some unfamiliar situations make it harder to maintain our natural body posture. Studies have shown that being immersed in water or just changing your stance can greatly reduce the effects of motion sickness. But again, we don't really know what's going on. We all do know some of the more common remedies for car queasiness, looking at the horizon, chewing gum, taking over-the-counter pills, but none of these are totally reliable, nor can they handle really intense motion sickness. And sometimes the stakes are far higher than just not being bored during a long car ride. At NASA, where astronauts are hurtled into space at 17,000 miles per hour, motion sickness is a serious problem. So in addition to researching the latest space-age technologies, NASA also spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep astronauts from vomiting up their carefully prepared space rations. Much like understanding the mysteries of sleep or curing the common cold, motion sickness remains one of those seemingly simple problems that, despite amazing scientific progress, we still know very little about. Perhaps one day the exact cause of motion sickness will be found, and with it, a completely effective way to prevent it. But that day is still on the horizon.
Welcome to the Department of Plagiarism Investigation. The DPI has dealt with numerous complex cases in their effort to bring plagiarists to justice and to rescue purloined texts. The first form of plagiarism that the DPI regularly encounters is known as brainchild snatching, in honor of the Latin word plagiarius, from which plagiarism originates. Brainchild snatchers sneak up on innocent papers and copy and paste them without citing any sources, putting quotation marks around direct quotes, or changing a word. They've also been known to steal and hold particularly eloquent essays for ransom. When brainchild snatchers get together, they form a kidnapping ring, which involves brainchild snatching from multiple sources. Some perpetrators have even been known to commit self-plagiarism, one of the laziest crimes in the annals of the DPI. Also known as one-sided collaborators, these oddballs snatch up entire texts or small passages that they've written before and present them as brand new material. Brainchild snatchers and kidnapping rings are easy for the DPI to catch. Just paste a few passages into a search engine and bam, they're caught red-handed. The more covert forms of plagiarism include the wild goose chase technique, in which plagiarists create fake authors, book titles, page numbers, or other information in order to cover up plagiarism. And the old synonym switcheroo, in which plagiarists utilize a thesaurus as their main weapon. By substituting a synonym for nearly every word in the document and leaving the sentence structure and order of the ideas the same, plagiarists give legitimate paraphrasing a very bad name. Shoddy paraphrasing is also a key part of variations on a smokescreen, a technique in which multiple passages are paraphrased, then pasted together into one. The thorniest issue that the DPI deals with is the misconception that you can never be accused of plagiarism if you use quotes and cite your sources. This is most certainly not the case, because a paper that is made up of passage upon passage of other people's ideas is known as a wholly quotable document. This is considered plagiarism since there are no original thoughts in the work. Similarly, passage after passage of too closely paraphrased text from multiple cited sources is also plagiarism of the pervasively paraphrased kind, because the ideas still aren't one's own. And lastly, the technique of revealing while concealing is plagiarism because it involves selective amnesia regarding one's sources in an attempt to cover up wholly quotable and pervasively paraphrased issues in a text. Some passages are meticulously documented, quoted, or paraphrased, while others are presented entirely as one's own. As you can see, the DPI has its hands full tackling all sorts of academic mischief and mayhem, ranging from the petty to the outrageous. Given the gravity of these transgressions, you might be wondering why you've never heard of the Department of Plagiarism Investigation's victories. That's because it doesn't technically exist. But people like you and me can be our own DPI agents to fight plagiarism and uphold the values of original thinking. We know that the best defense against plagiarism consists of writers who save themselves time, worry, and effort by taking the far easier road of just doing the work themselves. Today, more than half of all people in the world live in an urban area. By mid-century, this will increase to 70%. But as recently as 100 years ago, only 2 out of 10 people lived in a city, and before that, it was even less. How have we reached such a high degree of urbanization, and what does it mean for our future? In the earliest days of human history, humans were hunter-gatherers, often moving from place to place in search of food. But about 10,000 years ago, our ancestors began to learn the secrets of selective breeding and early agricultural techniques. For the first time, people could raise food rather than search for it, and this led to the development of semi-permanent villages for the first time in history. Why only semi-permanent, you might ask? Well, at first the villages still had to relocate every few years as the soil became depleted. It was only with the advent of techniques like irrigation and soil tilling about 5,000 years ago that people could rely on a steady and long-term supply of food, making permanent settlements possible. And with the food surpluses that these techniques produced, it was no longer necessary for everyone to farm. This allowed the development of other specialized trades and, by extension, cities. With cities now producing surplus food as well as tools, crafts, and other goods, there was now the possibility of commerce and interaction over longer distances. And as trade flourished, so did technologies that facilitated it, like carts, ships, roads, and ports. Of course, these things required even more labor to build and maintain, so more people were drawn from the countryside to the cities as more jobs and opportunities became available. If you think modern cities are overcrowded, you may be surprised to learn that some cities in 2000 BC had population densities nearly twice as high as that of Shanghai or Calcutta. One reason for this was that transportation was not widely available, so everything had to be within walking distance, including the few sources of clean water that existed then. And the land area of the city was further restricted by the need for walls to defend against attacks. The Roman Empire was able to develop infrastructure to overcome these limitations. But other than that, modern cities as we know them didn't really get their start until the Industrial Revolution, when new technology deployed on a mass scale allowed cities to expand and integrate further, establishing police, fire, and sanitation departments, as well as road networks and later electricity distribution. So what is the future of cities? Global population is currently more than 7 billion and is predicted to top out around 10 billion. Most of this growth will occur in the urban areas of the world's poorest countries. So how will cities need to change to accommodate this growth? First, the world will need to seek ways to provide adequate food, sanitation, and education for all people. Second, growth will need to happen in a way that does not damage the land that provides us with the goods and services that support the human population. Food production might move to vertical farms and skyscrapers, rooftop gardens, or vacant lots in city centers, while power will increasingly come from multiple sources of renewable energy. Instead of single-family homes, more residences will be built vertically. We may see buildings that contain everything that people need for their daily life, as well as smaller, self-sufficient cities focused on local and sustainable production. The future of cities is diverse, malleable, and creative, no longer built around a single industry, but reflecting an increasingly connected and global world.
Have you ever wondered how things are built within our bodies? Why our bodies can regrow and repair themselves, and how we can pass on genes from one generation to the next? Yet none of our man-made objects have these traits. They're simply thrown away when they break, and they definitely can't reproduce. The answer lies in something called self-assembly. Self-assembly is a system where unordered parts come together in an organized structure, completely on their own. This means that a pile of parts on your desk should, in theory, be able to move around on their own, find one another, and build something useful. This seems impossible, like Transformers or the Sandman, but it's exactly how our bodies are built, how our immune system works, and why we can reproduce. Self-assembly is the factory and copy machines within our bodies that make proteins fold and DNA replicate. It's a process that not only happens in the biological and chemical world, but is a phenomenon that can be seen from magnets to snowflakes, robotics, social networks, the formations of cities and galaxies, to name just a few. In biology and chemistry, self-assembly is everywhere, from atomic interactions, cellular replication, to DNA, RNA, and protein folding. Proteins are like bicycle chains with sequences of amino acid links. They self-assemble into 3D structures because of the interaction between the amino acids along the chain, as well as the relationship between the chain and the environment. These forces make the flexible chain fold into a 3D shape that governs the function of the protein. Viruses, on the other hand, are like soccer balls. They're made up of a series of subunits with specific shapes. Those shapes have attraction to one another, so they fit together in precise ways. Imagine you want to build a perfect sphere. It turns out that making a precise sphere through traditional means is actually quite difficult. Alternatively, you could try to self-assemble the sphere. One way would be to inflate the sphere like a bubble or a balloon. Another option would be to create many identical pieces that would come together to make a perfect sphere. You could try to put the pieces together one by one, but it might take a long time and you'd still have human errors. Instead, you could design a connection between the components like magnets and dump them into a container. When you shook the container, all the parts would find one another and build the sphere for you. Self-assembly is being used as a new design, science, and engineering tool for making the next generation of technologies easier to build, more adaptive, and less reliant on fossil fuels. Scientists are now making molecular microchips for computers where small molecular elements are given the right conditions to form themselves into organized pathways. Similarly, we can now use self-assembly as a way to make 3D structures with DNA, like capsules that could deliver drugs inside the body, releasing them only if certain conditions are met. Soon, self-assembly will be used for larger applications, where materials can repair themselves, water pipes can reconfigure on demand, buildings can adapt on their own to environment or dynamic loading, and space structures can self-assemble without humans. Imagine if our factories were more like organisms or brains, and our construction sites were like gardens that grow and adapt independently. The possibilities are endless, and it's now up to us to design a better world through self-assembly.
Have you ever heard the sound of frogs calling at night? For hundreds of millions of years, this croaking lullaby has filled the nighttime air. But recent studies suggest that these frogs are in danger of playing their final note. Over the past few decades, amphibian populations have been rapidly disappearing worldwide. Nearly 1/3 of the world's amphibian species are in danger of extinction, and over 100 species have already disappeared. But don't worry, there's still hope. Before we get into how to save the frogs, let's start by taking a look at why they're disappearing and why it's important to keep them around. habitat destruction is the #1 problem for frog populations around the world. There are 7 billion humans on the planet, and we compete with frogs for habitat. We build cities, suburbs, and farms on top of frog habitat, and chop forests and drain the wetlands that serve as home for numerous amphibian populations. Climate change alters precipitation levels, drying up ponds, streams, and cloud forests. As the Earth's human population continues to grow, so will the threats amphibians face. There are a variety of other factors contributing to the frog's decline. Overharvesting for the pet and food trade results in millions of frogs being taken out of the wild each year. Invasive species such as non-native trout and crayfish eat native frogs. Humans are facilitating the spread of infectious diseases by shipping over 100 million amphibians around the world each year, for use as food, pets, bait, and in laboratories and zoos, with few regulations or quarantines. One of these diseases, chytridiomycosis, has driven stream-dwelling amphibian populations to extinction in Africa, Australia, Europe, and North, Central, and South America. On top of all these problems, we add hundreds of millions of kilograms of pesticides to our ecosystems each year, and these chemicals are easily absorbed through amphibians' permeable skin, causing immunosuppression or a weakened immune system and developmental deformities. Okay, so why are these little green guys worth keeping around? Frogs are important for a multitude of reasons. They're an integral part of the food web, eating flies, ticks, mosquitoes, and other disease vectors, thus protecting us against malaria, dengue fever, and other illnesses. Tadpoles keep waterways clean by feeding on algae, reducing the demand on our community's filtration systems, and keeping our cost of water low. Frogs serve as a source of food for birds, fish, snakes, dragonflies, and even monkeys. When frogs disappear, the food web is disturbed, and other animals can disappear as well. Amphibians are also extremely important in human medicine. Over 10% of the Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine have gone to researchers whose work depended on amphibians. Some of the antimicrobial peptides on frog skin can kill HIV, some act as painkillers, and others serve as natural mosquito repellents. Many discoveries await us if we can save the frogs, but when a frog species disappears, so does any promise it holds for improving human health. Fortunately, there are lots of ways you can help, and the best place to start is by improving your ecological footprint and day-to-day actions. The next time you listen to that nighttime lullaby, don't think of it as just another background noise. Hear it as a call for help, sung in perfect croaking harmony.
In the early 1960s, Dick Fosbury tried his hand at almost every sport, but never excelled at anything until, at the age of 16, he turned to the high jump. But when he couldn't compete against the strong athletes at his college, using the standard high jump techniques of the time, Fosbury tried to jump a different way, backwards. Instead of jumping with his face towards the bar, bringing each leg over in the traditional straddle method, he jumped with his back towards the bar. Fosbury improved his record by over half a foot and left his coaches amazed by this strange new style of high jumping. During the next few years, Fosbury perfected his high jump style, won the U.S. national trials, and assured his place in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico. In the Olympic Games, Fosbury amazed the world with his new technique, winning a gold medal with an Olympic record leap of 2.24 meters. By the next Olympic Games, almost all the competing high jumpers had adopted what came to be known as the Fosbury flop. What's the secret behind the technique? It lies in a physics concept called the center of mass. For every object, we can locate the average position of all of its mass by taking into account how the mass is spread around the object. For instance, the center of mass of a flat rectangular object of uniform density will be in the intersection of both diagonals, in equal distance from each corner. We can find the center of mass for other objects by similar calculations, or by finding the object's balancing point, which lies right underneath its center of mass. Try balancing a broom by holding it and slowly bringing your hands together until they meet. This balancing point lies right underneath the broom's center of mass. We humans also have a center of mass. When most people stand up, their center of mass is around the belly. But what happens to your center of mass when you lift your hands in the air? Your center of mass moves upwards. It moves all the time as you move through the day, based on how your body is positioned. It can even move outside of your body. When you bend forward, your center of mass is located below your bent belly, in a place where there is no mass at all. Weird to think about, but that's the average position of all your mass. Many objects' center of mass are outside their bodies. Think of donuts or boomerangs. Now look at the Fosbury flop and follow the position of the center of mass of the jumper. The jumper runs very fast, so he can divert his horizontal velocity to vertical velocity, and jumps. Wait for it. There. Look at the jumper's center of mass as his body bends backward. It's below the bar. That is the secret behind the jump. With the old pre-Fosbury techniques, the jumper had to apply enough force to lift his center of mass above the bar by a few inches in order to clear it. The Fosbury flopper doesn't have to do that. The genius of the Fosbury flop is that the jumper can apply the same amount of force but raise his body much higher than before. That means he can raise the bar so high that even when his center of mass can't go any higher, his arcing body can. Fosbury's technique brought the high jump to new heights by splitting the jumper's body away from his center of mass, giving it that much more room to clear higher and higher bars. So the Fosbury flop may be sports history's only great leap forward that is also a great leap backward.
Every cell in your body is separated from those around it by its outermost layer, its membrane. A cell membrane must be both sturdy and flexible. Imagine a membrane made of metal, great at keeping the cell's guts inside, but horrible at letting materials flow in and out. But a membrane made of fishnet stocking would go too far in the opposite direction, leaky but easily torn. So the ideal membrane falls somewhere in the middle. Over the past few centuries, we've learned a lot about the way membranes work. The tale starts in the late 1800s, when, according to legend, a German woman named Agnes Pockels was doing dishes. Her observation that not all detergents dissolve grease in the same way piqued her curiosity, so she made careful measurements of the size of soapy films that formed on the surface of a metal tray filled with water. Later, in the 1920s, GE scientists Irving Langmuir and Kathleen Blodgett re-examined the problem with a more elaborate contraption and found that those tiny slicks were in fact a single layer of oil molecules. Each oil molecule has one side that loves water and floats on the surface, and one side that loathes water and protrudes into the air. So what does it have to do with cell membranes? Well, at the turn of the 20th century, chemists Charles Overton and Hans Meyer demonstrated that the cell membrane is composed of substances that, like oil, have a water-loving part and a water-loathing part. We now call these substances lipids. In 1925, two scientists, Evert Gorder and Francois Grendel, pushed our understanding further. They designed an experiment meant to test whether cell membranes are made of only one layer of lipids, a monolayer, or two layers stacked on top of one another, called a bilayer. Gorder and Grendel drew blood from a dog, a sheep, a rabbit, a goat, a guinea pig, and human volunteers. From each of these samples, they extracted all the lipids from all the red blood cells and placed a few drops of this extract on a tray of water. True to form, the lipids, like oil, spread out into a monolayer, whose size Gorder and Grendel could measure. If they compared the surface area of that monolayer to the surface area of the intact red blood cells, they'd be able to tell whether the red blood cell membrane is 1 or 2 layers thick. To understand the design of their experiment, imagine looking down at a sandwich. If you measure the surface area of what you see, you'll get the dimensions of a single slice of bread, even though there are 2 slices, one stacked perfectly atop the other. But if you open the sandwich and place the 2 slices side by side, you get twice the surface area. The Gorder and Grendel experiment is basically the same idea. The open sandwich is the monolayer formed by the extracted cellular lipids spreading out into a sheet. The closed sandwich is the intact red blood cell membrane. Lo and behold, they observed a 2-to-1 ratio, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that a cell membrane is a bilayer, which when unstacked yields a monolayer twice its size. So almost 30 years before the double helix structure of DNA was elucidated, a single experiment involving fancy versions of household materials enabled deep insight into the basic architecture of the cell.
Say two people are walking down the street and they bump into each other. They'll just shake it off and walk on. Sometimes that happens with molecules too. They just bounce off each other and that's that. But what if two people were to bump into each other and during that collision, one person's arm got severed and reattached to the other person's face? Now that sounds really weird, but it's similar to one of the many ways that molecules can react with each other. Two molecules can join and become one. One can split apart and become two. Molecules can switch parts. All these changes are chemical reactions, and we can see them happening around us. For example, when fireworks explode, or iron rusts, or milk goes bad, or people are born, grow old, die, and then decompose. But chemical reactions don't just happen willy-nilly. Everything has to be right. First, the molecules have to hit each other in the right orientation. And second, they have to hit each other hard enough, in other words, with enough energy. Now you're probably thinking that a reaction just happens in one direction and that's it. Sometimes that's true. For example, things can't unburn or unexplode. But most reactions can happen in both directions, forward and reverse. There's no reason that our face arm guy can't bump into armless girl, reattaching that arm back to its original socket. Now let's zoom out a bit. Now let's say that you've got 1,000 people on the street, and all of them start with their limbs normally attached. At the beginning, every collision is a chance for person A to transfer an arm to person B's face. And so at the beginning, more and more people end up with arms attached to their faces or arms missing. But as the number of people with arm faces and missing arms grows, collisions between those people become more likely. And when they bump into each other, guess what? Normal appendage people are reproduced. Now the number of limb transfers per second forward will start high and then fall, and the number of limb transfers per second backward will start at 0 and then rise. Eventually they'll meet, they'll be the same. And when that happens, the number of people in each state stops changing, even though people are still bumping into each other and exchanging limbs. Now, how many people do you think there are in each state? Half and half, right? No. Well, maybe. It depends. It could be 50-50, but it could be 60-40 or 15-85 or anything. We chemists have to get our little gloved hands dirty. We're in a lab, so not really dirty, to figure out what the actual distribution of molecules is. Even though each of these limb transfers is a pretty dramatic event for the people involved, if we zoom out, we see population numbers that don't change. We call this nirvana equilibrium, and it doesn't just happen with chemical reactions. Things like gene pools and highway traffic show the same pattern. It looks pretty still from 30,000 feet, but there is lots of crazy stuff happening on the ground. You just need to zoom in to see it.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parents and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds. He called the yellow color trait the dominant one, because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plants self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of a gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous P, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous P, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype. To clearly visualize how alleles are distributed amongst descendants, we can use a diagram called the Punnett square. You just place the different alleles on both axes, and then you figure out the possible combinations. Let's look at Mendel's P's, for example. Let's write the dominant yellow allele as an uppercase Y, and the recessive green allele as a lowercase y. The uppercase y always overpowers its lowercase friend, so the only time you get green babies is if you have two lowercase y's. In Mendel's first generation, the yellow homozygous P mom will give each P kid a yellow dominant allele, and the green homozygous P dad will give a green recessive allele, so all the P kids will be yellow heterozygous. Then, in the second generation, where the two heterozygous kids marry, their babies could have any of the three possible genotypes, showing the two possible phenotypes in a 3-to-1 proportion. But even peas have a lot of characteristics. For example, besides being yellow or green, peas may be round or wrinkled. So we could have all these possible combinations: round yellow peas, round green peas, wrinkled yellow peas, and wrinkled green peas. To calculate the proportions for each genotype and phenotype, we can use a Punnett square too. Of course, this will make it a little more complex. And lots of things are more complicated than peas, like, say, people. These days, scientists know a lot more about genetics and heredity, and there are many other ways in which some characteristics are inherited. But it all started with Mendel and his peas.
Most atoms don't ride solo. Instead, they bond with other atoms. Now, bonds can form between atoms of the same element, or atoms of different elements. You've probably imagined bonding as a tug of war. If one atom is really strong, it can pull one or more electrons off another atom. Then you end up with one negatively charged ion and one positively charged ion, and the attraction between these opposite charges is called an ionic bond. This is the kind of sharing where you just give away your toy to someone else and then never get it back. Table salt, sodium chloride, is held together by ionic bonds. Every atom of sodium gives up one electron to every atom of chlorine. Ions are formed, and those ions arrange themselves in a 3D grid called a lattice, in which every sodium ion is bonded to 6 chloride ions, and every chloride ion is bonded to 6 sodium ions. The chlorine atoms never give the sodium atoms their electrons back. Now, these transactions aren't always so cut and dried. If one atom doesn't completely overwhelm the other, they can actually share each other's electrons. This is like a potluck, where you and a friend each bring a dish, and then both of you share both dishes. Each atom is attracted to the shared electrons in between them, and this attraction is called a covalent bond. The proteins and DNA in our bodies, for example, are held together largely by these covalent bonds. Some atoms can covalently bond with just one other atom, others with many more. The number of other atoms one atom can bond with depends on how its electrons are arranged. So, how are electrons arranged? Every atom of a pure, unbonded element is electrically neutral because it contains the same number of protons in the nucleus as it does electrons around the nucleus. And not all of those electrons are available for bonding. Only the outermost electrons, the ones in orbitals furthest from the nucleus, the ones with the most energy, only those participate in bonding. By the way, this applies to ionic bonding too. Remember sodium chloride? Well, the electron that sodium loses is the one furthest from its nucleus, and the orbital that electron occupies when it goes over to chlorine is also the one furthest from its nucleus. But back to covalent bonding. Carbon has 4 electrons that are free to bond, nitrogen has 3, oxygen 2. So carbon is likely to form 4 bonds, nitrogen 3 and oxygen 2. Hydrogen only has 1 electron, so it can only form 1 bond. In some special cases, atoms can form more bonds than you'd expect, but they'd better have a really good reason to do so, or things tend to fly apart. Groups of atoms that share electrons covalently with each other are called molecules. They can be small. For example, every molecule of oxygen gas is made up of just 2 oxygen atoms bonded to each other. Or they can be really, really big. Human chromosome 13 is just 2 molecules, but each one has over 37 billion atoms. And this neighborhood, this city of atoms, is held together by the humble chemical bond.
To understand climate change, think of the game Tetris. For eons, Earth has played a version of this game with blocks of carbon. They enter the atmosphere as carbon dioxide gas from volcanoes, decaying plant matter, breathing creatures, and the surface of the sea. And they leave the atmosphere when they're used by plants during photosynthesis, absorbed back into the ocean, or stored in soil and sediment. This game of Tetris is called the carbon cycle, and it's the engine of life on Earth. What's the connection to climate? Well, when that carbon dioxide is in the air waiting to be reabsorbed, it traps a portion of the sun's heat which would otherwise escape to space. That's why carbon dioxide is called a greenhouse gas. It creates a blanket of warmth known as the greenhouse effect that keeps our Earth from freezing like Mars. The more carbon dioxide blocks hang out in the atmosphere waiting to be cleared, the warmer Earth becomes. Though the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has varied through ice ages and asteroid impacts, over the past 8,000 years, the stable climate we know took shape, allowing human civilization to thrive. But about 200 years ago, we began digging up that old carbon that had been stored in the soil. These fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, are made from the buried remains of plants and animals that died long before humans evolved. The energy stored inside them was able to power our factories, cars, and power plants. But burning these fuels also injected new carbon blocks into Earth's Tetris game. At the same time, we cleared forests for agriculture, reducing the Earth's ability to remove the blocks. And since 1750, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has increased by 40% and shows no sign of slowing. Just like in Tetris, the more blocks pile up, the harder it becomes to restore stability. The extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere accelerates the greenhouse effect by trapping more heat near the surface and causing polar ice caps to melt. And the more they melt, the less sunlight they're able to reflect, making the oceans warm even faster. Sea levels rise, coastal populations are threatened with flooding, natural ecosystems are disrupted, and the weather becomes more extreme over time. Climate change may affect different people and places in different ways, but ultimately it's a game that we're all stuck playing. And unlike in Tetris, we won't get a chance to start over and try again.
We've all seen the movies where a monster, created by scientists in a laboratory, escapes to wreak havoc on the outside world. But what if the monster was not some giant rampaging beast destroying a city, but just a tiny amount of seaweed with the potential to disrupt entire coastal ecosystems? This is the story of Caulerpa taxifolia. Originally a naturally occurring seaweed native to tropical waters, in the 1980s, one strain was found to thrive in colder environments. This trait, combined with its beautiful bright green color and ability to grow quickly without maintenance, made it ideal for aquariums, which it helped keep clean by consuming nutrients and chemicals in the water. Further selective breeding made it even hardier, and soon it was used in aquariums around the world. But it was not long before a sample of this aquarium-developed superalgae turned up in the Mediterranean Sea near the famed Oceanographic Museum of Monaco. The marine biologist who found it believed that the museum had accidentally released it into the ocean along with aquarium waters, while museum directors claimed it had been carried into the area by ocean currents. Regardless of how it ended up there, the non-native Caulerpa multiplied rapidly, having no natural predators due to releasing a toxin that keeps fish away. And like some mythical monster, even a tiny piece that broke off could grow into a whole new colony. Through water currents and contact with boat anchors and fishing lines, it fragmented and spread throughout Mediterranean coastal cities, covering coral reefs. So what was the result of this invasion? Well, it depends on who you ask. Many scientists warn that the spread of Callirpa reduces biodiversity by crowding out native species of seaweed that are eaten by fish, with the biologist who first discovered its presence dubbing it killer algae. Other studies instead claimed that the algae actually had a beneficial effect by consuming chemical pollutants, one reason the aquarium strain was developed. But the disruption of a natural ecosystem by an introduced foreign species can have unpredictable and uncontrollable effects that may not be immediately visible. So when Callirpa taxifolia was discovered at Carlsbad's Agua Hedionda Lagoon near San Diego in the year 2000, having most likely come from the dumping of home aquarium water into a connecting storm drain, it was decided to stop it before it spread. Tarps were placed over the Callirpa colonies and chlorine injected inside. Although this method killed all other marine life trapped under the tarps, it did succeed in eradicating the algae, and native eelgrass was able to emerge in its place. By responding quickly, authorities in California were able to prevent Callirpa from propagating. But another occurrence of the strain in the coastal wetlands of Southeast Australia was left unchecked and allowed to spread. And unfortunately, a tarp cannot cover the Mediterranean Sea or the Australian coast. Invasive species are not a new problem and can indeed occur naturally. But when such species are the results of human-directed selective breeding or genetic modification and then released into the natural environment, their effect on ecosystems can be far more radical and irreversible. With the proliferation of new technologies and multiple threats to the environment, it is more important than ever for scientists to monitor and evaluate the risks and dangers, and for the rest of us to remember that what starts in our backyard can affect ecosystems half a world away.
The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified or passed over 200 years ago. But even though they're a bit, old, these first 10 amendments are still the most debated and discussed section of our Constitution today. So can you remember what they are? Let's take a look. The First Amendment is the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. This may be the most revered of the amendments. The First Amendment protects our rights to say and write our opinions, worship how we please, assemble together peacefully, and petition our government if we feel the need. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The original intent of the Second Amendment was to protect colonists from the invading British soldiers, but it now guarantees that you have the right to own a gun to defend yourself and your property. The Third Amendment is called the Quartering Amendment. It was written in response to the British occupation and as a result of the colonists having to house or quarter soldiers in their homes during the American Revolution. Because of this amendment, our government can never force us to house soldiers in our home. The Fourth Amendment is the right to search and seizure. The police can't come into our home without a search warrant and take our personal property. Today, many concerns have arisen about our rights to privacy and technology. For example, can the government track your location with your smartphone, or can social media postings such as on Facebook and Twitter be used without a warrant? On to the fifth. It's all about due process. You've probably heard the phrase, "I plead the Fifth," in movies or on TV. They're talking about the Fifth Amendment, which says that you don't have to take the witness stand against yourself if you may end up incriminating yourself. Okay, we're halfway done. The Sixth and Seventh Amendments are about how the legal system works. If you're accused of a crime, you have the right to a speedy public trial and an impartial jury. You also have the right to a lawyer and the right to take the stand if you choose. This is important because it will prevent the accused from sitting in prison forever and insist that the prosecution proceed with undue delay. The Seventh says you have the right to a jury trial where 12 impartial peers decide your innocence or guilt in the courtroom as opposed to a judge doing it all alone. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Is a death penalty cruel? Is it unusual? It's hard for Americans to agree on the definitions of cruel and unusual. The 9th and 10th Amendments are called the non-rights amendments. They say that the rights not listed in the Bill of Rights are retained by the people in the states. You have other rights that are not listed in the Constitution, and the states have the right to make their own policies, like instituting state taxes. So, now you know all 10 amendments. Can you remember them all? If not, remember this. The Bill of Rights are a crucial piece of American history, and though society has undergone many changes these past 200 and some years, the interpretation and application of these amendments are as vital today as they were when they were written.